I was suffering really severe harm from gambling. And during that decade, I transacted online alone around £4.8 million across 93 different betting accounts, lost £1.3 million. And, you know, about half of that, or £434,000 of that, was Santander's and the clients of Santander who I work for.
In my mind, I think it's time to kind of have a look and have a rethink and reevaluate how, you know, provisions and support is put in place in prisons.
Hello and welcome to the Invisible Addiction podcast. If you're a new listener, hi. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to this episode. And of course, if you're a long-time listener of the podcast, I hope you've been keeping well. Shortly, we'll be hearing a harrowing gambling addiction story. And around the midway point, we'll be hearing from Stephen Nyandu, who works for Bet No More UK as their safer gambling advisor. But before we go any further, I would like to make a short disclaimer and say that this is an informational podcast. If you're experiencing gambling problems, of course, I hope you relate to the stories you hear. That's what this podcast is all about. But please do seek professional help. Links to that support can be found on the Invisible Addiction website, www.theinvisibleaddiction.com/support. Right, without further ado, let's crack on with the podcast. Okay, so joining us on the other end of the line today is Paul Buck from the northwest of England. He's come onto the show to share his gambling addiction story with us and to tell us more about Epic Risk Management, the world's leading gambling harm minimization consultancy, which he founded and is the CEO. It gives me great pleasure to welcome him onto the podcast. It's been a long time coming. Paul, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you?
Alex, I'm great. Thanks for having me on. Really appreciate it. And you're right, it's been a long time coming. Apologies for a couple of false starts, but delighted to be here today and talking to you.
Fantastic. We got there. We've got there in the end. Well, before we dive into your story, could you give the listeners a brief introduction about your background and experience, where you grew up, where you studied, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, so I've always been from the northwest of England, from Preston. Big Preston North End fan. I think you have to be from Preston to be that. But yeah, no, I grew up in just outside of Preston. Very normal childhood. Very close family. You know, good set of friends who are still my friends now, etc. So yeah, it was quite a normal upbringing in the county of Lancashire.
Nice one. Well, I mean, we're going to dive straight into it. We've got a whole host of subjects that we can go into and topics. So I suppose it seems sensible to start with your story. So gambling, how did it start for you?
Yeah, well, as I said, you know, for the first 18 years, I'd never gambled at all. I had no interest in gambling. Now I'm 45, so your gambling was a very different beast back when I was growing up compared to what kids have to grow up with now. So you know, in those days, gambling was really in a bookie shop between 9 and 5, and it was really on three things. It was on dogs, horses, or the football pools at the time. So a completely different experience than people have now in the world, and how gambling is now in the world. And for 18 years, I was not interested. You know, I played cricket and I played football to quite a high standard growing up. And so I was quite competitive, but I had no interest in horses or dogs or gambling, full stop. And I think it all changed for me when I went to university. So I went to Leeds University when I was 18 in 1994. And the first thing you do when you go there is obviously you have something called Freshers Week, and you try out for all the different sports teams and different clubs and things like that were going out. And as I said, I played a bit of football, and I trialed for the Leeds University football team, and was fortunate enough to get picked. And there were 16 of us that were picked. And you know, when I went to uni, it was probably the first time I really had money in my bank account. Properly, you know, you had a student loan or student grant in those days, but you didn't even have to pay back. I think it was about £3,500. And, you know, you had your freedom. You have that change of environment. You're away from your mum and dad for the first time. You know, you've got all the time in the world to yourself and to your new friends and your new teammates and so on. And, you know, I thought it was going to be, you know, a really good time, you know, a really good time. And don't get me wrong, it did turn out to be that way, but it probably wasn't quite as I expected, because as I joined the football team at the university, it became apparent really quickly that the only thing that any of the other 15 lads were talking about was gambling. And, you know, that was even in those days when it was much more difficult to gamble. And these were guys who were only the same age as me. They were all 18 or 19. But every conversation was dominated by gambling. What bets had they got on? You know, how did they do yesterday? Have they heard of any tips for later on in the afternoon, etc.? And I found it quite difficult and quite strange. And then I lasted 4 days really before I ended up finishing lectures. It was one of those typical courses where in the first year you only have lectures 9 till 12, and then you've got the afternoon to yourselves. And what they did every day was finish lectures and walk down into Horsforth, which is near Headingley in Leeds, and go to the bookies, and then go to the pub, and then go to the bookies, and then go to the pub, which were always across the road from each other. So I ended up 4 days later going into a William Hill in Town Street in Horsforth for the first time. And you know, it was I found it quite a strange environment. There was some old people in there who were smoking still, and it was like their daily entertainment was to sit in the bookies all day, all afternoon, and chew the fat, if you like. And then there was quite a lot of students in there, which surprised me as well. There was quite a lot of kids from, or adults, I suppose, as they were then, but from university in there. And it was a real sort of bustling place to be, if you like. And I took a bit of a watching brief for a while. Just watched what everyone was doing, because I'd never been in the bookies before. I'd never placed a bet before. And everyone seemed to be putting, certainly my teammates, everyone seemed to be putting £10 each way on. So I thought, right, I'll have a go in the next race. Went over to the racing post. And really could make neither head nor tail of it. You know, the form figures, the weight figures, the jockey. Didn't know who were good jockeys and who were good trainers or whatever. So I did the old faithful and went and found a jockey who was running in blue and white, because I'm a Preston fan. It was as scientific as that. And I wrote out £10 each way on this betting slip. I took it over to the woman who was behind the kind of bulletproof screen at the bookies, and I gave her my slip and I gave her my £10. And there was this kind of pregnant pause, and it was like, I'm thinking, what have I done wrong here? And of course she said, where's the other tenner? And of course I put £10 each way, and I didn't realise you had to give £20 for that. I didn't even know what each way meant. So I handed the money across at the other tenner, and I remember vividly, as I opened my wallet and handed another £10 note across, I thought, what a waste of money this is. You know, and you know, I was brought up quite frugally. We weren't rich, we weren't poor, but you know, I thought, this is a waste of money, this. And I walked away definitely thinking, this horse is probably going to lose. It looks like it's the outsider of the whole field. This is the only bet I'm putting on. You know, I'm not spending all day every day doing this kind of thing. And the race went off. And as form figures suggested, my horse was right at the back, and I'm kind of written this bet off already. And then two fences before the end, it kind of jumped back into contention, or it jumped back into the screen. Going over the last, it kind of sprouted wings, and it ran off, and it won by about 12 lengths. And you know, it's hard to explain the feeling that gave me. About anybody who's listening to the podcast who's had issues with gambling or a gambling addiction or a disorder will probably know more than those who haven't. But I had this amazing feeling of euphoria. It was like a warm river flowing through your mind, flowing through your brain. And I now know what it was. It was kind of endorphins, dopamine, serotonin, etc., all being released and stuff. But at the time, it just felt incredible. And from that day onwards, I was a gambler. And you know, I wasn't somebody who was suffering a gambling problem or a gambling addiction or anything like that. But I was a gambler, and the reality is that I don't remember then one day for 17 years where I didn't place a bet of some sort in some way. And I don't think I became a gambling addict straight away or suffered a gambling disorder straight away, because I was in control of time, money, and cognition or brain space or thought process around it for probably up to 6 or 7 years. But but I was certainly a gambler. And for me, that's probably one of the really worrying parts of it, of how easy it is to flick that button. You know, as I said, for 18 years, I'd never had any interest in gambling whatsoever. Then suddenly, in a kind of 20-minute period in October 1994, I turned into someone who gambled every day for the next 17 years of their life. And you know, I often wonder what would have happened if that bet had lost. You know, would I not be sat here talking to you? Would I have not gambled again? Would I have reinforced in my brain that gambling's a mug's game? Or would it have happened anyway? I'm not sure. I'll never know that. But certainly that first win was a really big part of it for me.
Was it just horses then from there on in that you gambled on?
No, it wasn't. There was a lot of horse racing, and then you know, I didn't really do much with greyhounds until later on, when we owned some and also gambled on a lot of them. But it was mainly horses and football to start with. So you didn't have fixed odds betting terminals in the shops then. You know, they were much later on. I'm talking 1994 here. So they didn't have those in there. You didn't have slots. You didn't have online gambling. You know, you didn't have mobile phones or iPads or anything like that. You know, you had to go between 9 and 5, and you had to bet on in cash on something that was going on in the shop. So gambling was a very, very different experience in 1994 than it is in 2021.
Mm-hmm. So I just want to, I've got to say, Leeds University, fellow ex-student as well. What did you study, and where did you stay? Where was your hall's residence?
I studied business management and sports science.
Okay.
And I stayed in Headingley for 2 years and Horsforth for 1 year.
Oh, nice. It wasn't. I stayed in James Bailey. I don't know if I think that was fairly new, or Devonshire was the other one. Was full of what do we call them? Full of Ras. I think that's what we were. You know, we used to call them Devonshire.
No, we stayed in houses just by the cricket ground. So
nice. Yeah. Headingley's awesome, man. It's absolutely. It's a brilliant place. The Otley Run. Did you do that a few times?
Just a few, yeah.
Oh my goodness. Well, look, don't let me distract you. So, okay, so you've placed your first bet. You're at university. You're in the football team. You've got that kind of peer pressure, if you like. I don't know if that's the correct term, or the peer group betting. So, how did it progress? So you've said at this point that you're gambling, or you've become a gambler. So, how did it progress from there, Paul?
Yeah, so as I said, I don't think it became a problem for me until later on. And you know, when I talk about it becoming a problem, you know, there's different definitions of what that is. But for me, it's when you are spending money or time or thought process or you know, cognition that you can't afford to lose, or that you could, you know, you start missing out on other things. And for me, I wasn't doing that. You know, I was doing the same as what my mates were doing. So I wasn't losing time with my mates. I wasn't spending money I didn't have. You know, I wasn't thinking about gambling all the time when I was doing other things, be it studying or playing football or whatever else. So, you know, I think, you know, there's got to be a recognition that not everybody who gambles has a problem with it. In fact, most don't. And I think for the first few years, I certainly didn't. And then I finished university in 97. I went back to Preston, which is where I live, as I said before. And I went into retail. I worked for a company called Littlewoods, an Index, with the same company. So Index was kind of an Argos equivalent. So neither of them are really on the high street anymore. And I worked in retail, working long hours, and worked up from a kind of on the sales floor to cash office manager to store manager to regional manager over a kind of 4-year period. And again, I think at that point, I wasn't gambling in a way which was an issue to me or was a problem to me. I was gambling, and I was gambling more, but I was earning more money, but I wasn't missing work or time with family or anything like that to gamble. And then I think it all changed really in 2001. I made a decision I was going to change career. I saw a advert for a financial advisor role with Abbey National, which is now obviously Santander, Europe's largest bank. And I thought, yeah, I'm going to go for that. You know, it's a bit of a change. It wasn't what I thought I was going to do, but actually it seems quite local. It seems quite well paid. And I think I'd be quite good at that, looking at the job description. So two things happened really in 2001. One is I got that job as a financial advisor, and the second one is I got married to my wife. And really, the next decade was when my life changed completely, and I had these kind of three worlds going on, three quite compartmentalized worlds, where, you know, at the first I kept them all completely separate throughout the decade. At first because I really wanted to, and secondly because I really had to, as you'll hear as I go through the story. And yeah, the first one of those was work. And as I said, for 5 years I was a pretty successful financial advisor. In 2006 I became a regional manager, and in 2010 I became a divisional manager. So on the face of it, you know, the career seemed to be going quite well, which is against what you know, many people think around gambling addiction. Of course, mine did implode eventually, but it was kind of 10 years later. The second world was family. So as I said, I got married to Anna in 2001, and then Connor came along in 2004, Rebecca in 2006, and Georgia in 2010. Nice. You know, I had a very normal family: mum and dad, brother-in-law, sister, granny, granddad, who both lived till they were 99 and 100, etc. I had no health issues. So I think the reason I'm sort of saying that is that on the face of it, looking in from the outside, you know, Paul Buck's world probably looked like quite a decent one, you know, quite an enviable one almost. But of course, what was happening as a third world, completely separate from that, was I was suffering what we now call a pathological gambling disorder, or a gambling disorder, or, you know, it's labelled in so many different ways. But I was suffering really severe harm from gambling. And during that decade, I transacted online alone around £4.8 million across 93 different betting accounts, lost £1.3 million. And, you know, about half of that, or £434,000 of that, was Santander's and the clients of Santander who I worked for. So yeah, it was a pretty miserable decade. It was a very depressing decade. It wasn't a decade that I would wish on anybody. And yeah, it was pretty horrendous, really.
Jeez, 4.8. That's amazing. That's incredible. That's incredible. At this point, had you sort of got into owning racehorses and greyhounds as well?
Yeah, there was a lot of things that went on, and I think this is a really big point around all this as well. That you know, if I'd been, I mean, I never want to say that one addiction is more serious than the other, because I don't think they are. I think they're all serious in their own right. But you know, if I was a drug addict during that decade, I was a heroin user. In terms of seriousness of it, I was a heroin user. If I was an alcoholic, during that decade, I was probably drinking meths or really high volume spirits and so on. And, you know, the absolute reality is, and the crude reality is, I wouldn't have been able to do that for a decade, because the body would have started showing physical signs. You know, you would have started showing, you know, your organs would have started giving up. You'd have started changing color without being too crude, etc. And you wouldn't have been able to keep it hidden. But for me, I kept this completely hidden from anybody who really knew me. Other than the people who trained the 2 racehorses that I owned and the 16 greyhounds that I owned. So, you know, I got so involved in that world in terms of, as I said, owning a racehorse on the flat, owning a racehorse over jumps, only ever owning A1 greyhounds because a horrible ego had kicked in that I only wanted to own the best of them, and then you wouldn't run them until they dropped down to A7 standard, etc. But I was also a member of 14 VIP clubs. You know, I was taken all around the world to gamble, and you know, that made you feel very special. And obviously, you know, you now know that you were taken on all those trips and sent all those hampers and everything else because, you know, you're a really bad gambler, so a really good customer. So I was a member of 14 VIP clubs. I had 16 credit cards and loans with £180,000 credit limit. And I just kept paying it off and putting it back on again, and paying it off and putting it back on again. And, you know, it was very rare, really, certainly in the last half of that decade, that I ever put a bet on less than £1,000. It was quite a really high values. But I think one point I really want to stress there, you know, we're talking about big figures, like £4.8 million and big bets. But I don't think I had any more of a gambling problem than someone else who maybe earned £1,000 a month and gambles £2,000 a month. It's always just gambling with things you can't afford, be it time or be it money. So yeah, the figures are quite shocking. And yes, there were some big rock bottoms, which I guess we're about to talk about. But, you know, a gambling problem doesn't have to be, or a gambling issue doesn't have to be millions of pounds or hundreds of thousands of pounds or prison sentences or suicide attempts or anything like that. It can be much less sort of headline grabbing things and just be as serious.
No, I agree. I was going to say it's a big myth, isn't it, that if you're earning lots of money and you know, quote unquote, spending within your means, that, you know, therefore you don't have a gambling problem. But no, I totally agree. It's completely it's relative, isn't it? It's relative to your situation. So I'm interested in the VIP schemes. I'm also interested in knowing what types of betting you're doing at this point. I guess at this point you've moved online as well.
Yeah, and I think that was the really big thing for me, and I know for a lot of other people as well. You know, gambling suddenly moved from being 9 till 5 in a betting shop and in cash to now being 24/7, to being anonymous, to being just a figure in the corner of the screen rather than tangible cash and actually handing money over or receiving money, which obviously makes it more real. And of course, the plethora of betting opportunities that came along with it. So both within the bookies, where I would spend every day an hour between 5 and 6 with £500 in cash on top of all the stuff online. But I would, both in the bookies with FOBTs, and then obviously with online and the slots and the casino, as well as all the different sports markets, etc. You know, it completely changed the gambling landscape. And made it much more dangerous in many, many ways, both in terms of anonymity, opportunity, speed of play, and things like that. So it did change fundamentally from when I placed that first bet in 1994 right through to when I placed my last bet in 2011. And, you know, it's changed again since. You know, I'm happy to say I've not gambled since 2011 in November of that year, but it has changed again since. And, there's more opportunities to play. There's more markets to bet on. And whilst most people can stay in control, there is a smallish percentage, but a very significant number of people who can't. And realistically, that number is growing. I know there's a lot of arguments that it's not, but you only have to apply logic to it to know that number is growing. And I think, you know, that's why good prevention, good research, good treatment, and good regulation and so on is really, really important.
I'm sure we'll come on to that. We'll kind of placeholder that, and we'll come on to that a little later, if we may, Paul, with your work through Epic. So talk us through. It's never easy talking through a rock bottom, but talk us about the depths and how bad it got for you, Paul.
Yeah, no, sure. So as I said, this sort of carried on through the decade. And then eventually my last bet was placed on November the 27th, 2011. And this was really, when I placed that bet, which was, I think it was about £2,400 on a Paul Nicholls and Ruby Walsh hole called Fistral Beach. And it hit the first fence really hard and then didn't finish the race. So it sort of petered out really. And I didn't realize that was my last bet. You know, I've heard a lot of stories like Tony O'Reilly's story, for instance, where he sat on the edge of his bed with the Epsom Derby, etc. It wasn't like that for me. You know, I didn't realize this was going to be my last bet. But I placed that bet on November 27th. And then that same day, I read an article in The Independent around the death of Gary Speed, the footballer. And, you know, what had happened with Gary, he had a fantastic 20-year Premier career with Newcastle and Leeds and Everton, amongst others. He was having a fantastic career with Wales as a national team boss. He'd really turned them around. And, you know, he was at the top of his game, really. And then suddenly the whole nation was shocked, not just the football community, but the whole nation, really. But when he went out for a night out with some ex-teammates, he went home to his house that he shared with his wife and his young children. He went into his garage and he found some cord and he took his own life with it. And his wife found him the following morning. And, you know, there was an article in The Independent which basically had a lot of experts surmising as to why would this have happened? You know, why would someone like Gary Speed have taken his own life? And there was the usual things in there, such as, did he have financial problems? Did he have relationship problems? Was he being blackmailed? Did he have mental health problems? And one of them was written that, did he have a gambling problem? And if he did have a gambling problem, this is what he would be doing. So he'd be gambling till every penny had gone. He would be gambling. His concentration would be on everything to do with gambling rather than his friends or his family or his career or anything like that. And really all the attributes of what somebody who's suffering a gambling disorder would do. And it turned out that Gary wasn't, I must stress this, he wasn't a huge gambler. I think it's widely reported he had quite a deep depression, but he didn't, it wasn't due to gambling. But what this article did do was describe me to the hilt. And I think this was probably quite a strange thing with mine, in that, I'd never tried to give up. I speak to a lot of people in the recovery community and in the lived experience community, and they've had numerous attempts to try and give up, and then just haven't quite managed to do it. And there's been a relapse, and relapse has been very much part of their journey. For me, that wasn't the case. I trained my brain that gambling was really the only thing that made sense. For me, during that decade, it was the wife that was the problem. It was the kids that was the problem. It was the job that was the problem. It was the traffic on the M6 that was the problem. It was the dog that was the problem. Everything else was the problem, and gambling was the only thing that made sense to me. Gambling was the only place that felt like a safe place. And there's no doubt that for virtually a full decade, certainly 8 years, I used gambling as my escapism. I used gambling as a coping mechanism, and it was a place where I felt safe, whereas the rest of the world was kind of going on and getting too big around me. So one and only attempt to give up really was on November the 27th, 2011, and thankfully, as I said, touch wood, that I've not gambled since. And what happened then was quite interesting. I kept reading the article. I couldn't put it down. There was something strange going on. What I think was happening, those three worlds were all growing and growing and growing. And this article was the thing that made them kind of bang into each other and explode, if that made sense. It was too big for the mind at that point. And I went missing. I phoned my wife and said, look, I'm going to be going away for a few days. Don't worry about me. I'm fine, but I just need to sort a few things out. And, in my job, I used to be away quite a lot anyway. I had quite a big region and stuff. So it wasn't unusual to be away. So she didn't really have any red flag warnings around it, I don't think. But I went round and I replaced the addiction to gambling with the addiction to gambling research. And so I went round for 10 days, the whole of the north of England, to all different libraries in Newcastle and Leeds, back to my university one, etc. And I just read everything that had ever been written about gambling, trying to get my head around what's this thing that's beaten me, what's this problem that I've got. And I'm having this whole kind of epiphany moment, if you like, in terms of everything, not only that you've had a gambling addiction, but also all the things you've done to fund it and how you've hurt people and everything else. And I didn't really sleep, I didn't really eat or anything for that whole 10 days. But then on December the 8th, I needed to be back in Preston for my divisional directors meeting that I was holding. I got back for that. We held a divisional directors meeting that morning. We talked about tax year end, which was coming up in 3 or 4 months' time. We talked about the Grand Prix and who would we take to the next one, because Santander were sponsoring at that point and still do. And then at lunchtime, everyone else out for lunch, and I didn't. I went up from my middle floor room at the branch of Santander on Preston High Street in Fishergate, and I went up to an unused storeroom, which is at the top of the building, and my intention was to jump out the window. My intention was the world would be a better place without me. The walls were closing in. Immense guilt all of a sudden. There hadn't really been any guilt at all at any point, but there was immense guilt, and it just felt like the world would very definitely be a better place without me. And I couldn't open the window, it was locked, it was kind of sealed shut as well and stuff. So I took the other decision, which was to take off my Santander tie, the red tie with the flames on and everything. I hung it across a wooden beam, which was at the top of the building. I stood up on a chair and I put my neck into the tie and I kicked the chair away. And there was almost a calmness there. There was there wasn't hysteria or crying. I hadn't left a note. I hadn't even really planned it at all. But there was just there was a real calmness, but this was the right thing to do because the world would be a better place without me. And I think to this day, my lucky stars that I'm here. I came around 3 hours later, according to a forensic report. My glasses were smashed, my suit was ripped, my head was all cut open around the crown of my head. And what I'd obviously done is I'd slipped out and smashed my head on the floor and knocked myself unconscious. I left the building through a side entrance. I staggered through Preston at around 3:30, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Blood pouring everywhere. I got in my car. I went to my mum's, which was about 10 miles away, and changed my mum's life forever. Rather than being Paul, the one you don't need to worry about, Paul, the one who's got all the money in the world, he's got a great job. All right, he doesn't speak to us as much, but why would he? He's got a really important job now. To now being the one who's Paul, who's got a gambling addiction, he's got nearly £1 million worth of debt, and he's just tried to take his own life at work. So not an easy conversation to have with my wife, and then with my mum, and then an hour later I've got to go and have the same with my wife and tell her that our whole marriage really for the first 10 years I'd had this third world going on, and it's left us massively in debt and worse to come. So yeah, that was the rock bottom, and I think that's the important point to make, that if gambling does become an issue and becomes a disorder, you almost definitely always end up in one of four places or a combination of them. So you end up with no money or bankrupt, you end up with relationship breakdown or divorce, you end up with a criminal conviction or in prison, or you end up suicidal or in the most heartbreaking ways dead. And that's the reality, and that's why it's so important that prevention of harm is at the forefront of everything we do, which is what we do with Epic. Just to complete the story very quickly, I went into work the following day and told them everything. Said, look, I've had gambling addiction. I've tried to attempt suicide in a branch yesterday, and I've stolen this money, and gave them the list of where it all had come from and so on. So now I'd had this realization; it just wasn't an option not to come forward. You also, almost like your moral compass reset, if that makes sense, overnight. And sure enough, I was charged. I was on bail for 6 months, where they were pulling our financial stuff apart, a lot of legal proceedings. But most importantly, I was trying to get over a gambling addiction and work out how to think again, and how to speak to my kids again, and how to speak to my wife again, and build relationships again, whilst this whole media storm's going on at the same time. And on June the 29th, 2012, I went to Preston Crown Court, and I was convicted of 16 counts of fraud, and 2 years, 8 months in prison, of which I served about a year in HMP Preston, which is a very violent Victorian prison in Lancashire, and then HMP Kirkham, which is a kind of open prison near Blackpool. And it was there where I had a decision to make. Do you go and get whatever job you can get, or do you actually use that experience of both a decade-long addiction and the rock bottoms of that, and try and stop that happening to other people? And that was a decision I made quite quickly, and spent 10 months in prison putting the business plan for Epic together of where's the gap, what's needed, and go and do it in June 2013 when you released.
Wow, Paul, that was really hard to listen to, if I'm honest, and I can't imagine what it's like for you to tell the story. And no, thank you for sharing that, because it's most illuminating. I suppose there's lots of questions that spur in my mind. I mean, I can't imagine what that would have been like that first day, telling your mum, telling your wife. By this point, was it an admission? Was that in your eyes the first day of your recovery?
Yeah, I think it absolutely was. And when I got interviewed by the police, I think I've still got a record at Preston Police Station of the longest first interview. There was no comments or anything. It was 4 hours 34 minutes long, and I think it almost felt very cathartic to actually talk to somebody about it for the first time in 10 years. I'd kept it very hidden. It often gets called a hidden addiction, doesn't it? And for me, talking to my mum, which is obviously very emotional, and my wife, which was also very emotional, but then also having that police interview as well, it was the first time I'd really spoken to anyone about it for a long, certainly the downsides of it. And straight away, as soon as I started talking to people about it, even in those really false environments of that conversation with your wife, your mum, and the police detectives at Preston, it felt like there was a weight being lifted off the shoulders just by telling people. Now, some will say it might not have been the smartest thing in the world. These guys are trying to put you in prison and everything else, but there was never going to be a trial because I'd handed myself in. I wasn't then going to say I'm not guilty. So just being able to speak to people about it was very cathartic. And I think you're right. That might have been the day that nearly ended my life, but it was also the first day of the rest of my life, if that makes sense. And yeah, there was further hurdles to go over, such as court proceedings, prison proceedings, recovery, treatment, etc. But it definitely was the first day of the rest of your life. Yeah.
So at this point, again, are you immediately getting treatment? Are you attending like Gamblers Anonymous? Talk us through the treatment, the help you and the support you got throughout that period before you went to prison.
Yeah. So work paid for counselling straight away through our employee assistance program. So I didn't get actually sacked until the day I got sentenced in June. So they were actually, to be fair to them, quite supportive at that point. And yeah, they paid for a counsellor, and that's a counsellor that I still see now. Not because I think I'm going to gamble again, but I think talking about this is really, really important. And actually, I think a lot of the reason that I ended up where I did was bottling things up, keeping things hidden, and so on. And we're big advocates at Epic about problem shared. A problem shared is a problem halved, and you'll see that a lot in our different profiles. But yeah, I had that, and then I phoned GamCare to try and get counselling through them, but they wouldn't accept me because I was already getting counselling somewhere else, and there's kind of a conflict of therapy, I think, or something like that. They explained it, and then I found the number and the details for Dr Henrietta Bowden-Jones down at the National Problem Gambling Clinic in Soho, and I phoned her, and she said, "Can you get down here? I want to see you face to face." So I managed to get the money together to get a train fare down from Lancashire down to London. I went to see Henrietta, and she was incredibly supportive. She obviously understood completely what I was going through. She explained it all through to me. There was Dr. Neil Smith at the time who was there as well. I don't think he's there anymore. But really the support that I got from both the counsellor and the clinic with Henrietta probably made sure that there was no sort of relapse or reattempt at my own life or anything like that. So yeah, I would say life-saving treatment really in many ways.
And what are you working through at this point? Are you trying to get to the root of the addiction? Are you trying to understand triggers, or is it literally just sort of talking therapy?
Yeah, I think it was two things, and people say you shouldn't have more than one kind of therapy at a time, and I'm sure there'll be people listening to this who will probably agree. But for me, they both did different things. So in terms of the counsellor, that was very much getting to the root of what had happened, talking it through. And again, you kept it kind of hidden for a decade, but that was very much around that whole kind of thing around root cause, around how it made you feel, why do you think it started, that kind of thing. Whereas the stuff at the clinic was more very sort of CBT based, so how you can look at things going forward. So how you can look at situations differently. So if you're walking down the road and somebody crosses the road and doesn't say anything to you, is that because they've ignored you and they've got a real problem with you and paranoia set in, or is it because they just didn't see you and they crossed the road and it was just so instant? So you have to learn how to think again. You have to learn how to speak to people again. You have to learn how to look at every individual situation and think differently again, because as a gambler, your whole mentality changes, the whole way that you deal with things changes. It's a really severe mental health condition, and certainly as you go to the more severe ends of it, the harms definitely leave an effect. So you do almost have to rebuild your life again, really similar to if you broke your back really badly. You'd have to have an operation, and you'd have to really have physio to make sure you get your mobility back and you get all your different, you get your different movements back and get back to some kind of normality. For me, I think I really broke my brain or really broke my mind. It's a psychological and behavioral addiction. And so for me, it was a case of fixing it, but then really continuing to work on it to get anywhere near where it was before.
I would love to. I'd love to really kind of dive into, brain scans and learn a little bit more. I know there was a BBC documentary where I think they say they did a brain scan of a problem gambler, and win or lose, the sort of dopamine hit was about the same. I also agree with you on about the brain and the effects it has. I don't know if it was a combination of things for me, but I became a real cynic, very miserable, very glass half empty. And that's been a long kind of journey to kind of repair. I thought at one point I was never going to be able to kind of flip that. And luckily a year or two down the line, things are getting better. But I definitely agree. So Paul, talk us through, so you've got the court case. Was it, as I say, it didn't go to trial, or it was just a plain simple verdict, as it were? Talk us through that moment where you've had to prepare, I guess, your wife, your family, you're preparing for prison and such like.
Yeah, no, there was no trial because obviously I'd handed myself in, so there was no trial to work out whether I was guilty or not. So what you have is you have an initial magistrate's hearing where you really just confirm your name, and if it's over a certain amount of money, which is around £20,000, you'll get referred up to the Crown Court. So that took about 5 minutes. But the problem, as soon as it hits the courts, it also hits the papers. So, bankers weren't popular back in 2012. So, there was an awful lot of press coverage about it, certainly locally. So, of course, you've got the kind of embarrassment, you've got the kind of worry about, is anybody going to say anything to the kids at school? My wife, who's a teacher, is anyone going to say something with her employment? So there was that side of it. And then you go to a pre-sentence hearing at Crown Court, and at that point they order a report from probation. And what I had on Dr Bowden-Jones' advice was I had a forensic psychiatry report, which I think is a really, really vital part of any mitigation for anyone else who goes through it, because it really does a proper diagnosis of all your activity, your mental state of mind, and also really give some recommendations around prison and the way forward. And for me, that was about 4 hours long. That was a really difficult thing to do because it started from childbirth right through to current point. But that said, this guy's got one of the worst gambling addictions we've ever seen in 34 years. Going to prison isn't going to be beneficial. In fact, it could lead to immense vulnerability, etc. And that was handed into the judge as well. But the top and bottom of it is, with any case like this, and unfortunately, there's more and more of these cases of gambling root cause, I guess, that are ending up in prison or certainly conviction. Is that it's all done on figures. It's all done on how much you've stolen. And the cut-off figure is 20,000. I've known a number of people who've been between 15 and 20,000 have ended up getting a suspended sentence, a sentence in the community. But certainly on a figure of 434,000 or anywhere near that, you're going to prison. There's no doubt about it. It just depends on how long for and what kind of mood the judge is on the day, which is... I think there's a lot of work to do in the criminal justice system on that to make sure that there's a fair trial for people. But no, for me, as I said, I got pre-sentence. I was told pretty much at the pre-sentence report, you are going to prison, so get yourself ready, get your affairs in order. And on June the 29th, I went with a bag packed, family in the courtroom, a lot of press in the courtroom, and he kind of started by saying, this is a horrendous fraud. Gambling's no mitigation. At the end of the day, gambling's an entertainment. Gambling's something that people can do. Starting point 7 years. And I remember a kind of very sobering moment when he said that, and I thought back to myself. I thought, how has it come to this? How am I stood in front of this? How am I stood in front of this judge saying starting point 7 years when it all started with that £10 each way on that horse in 1994, 17 years earlier, or 18 years earlier, and he then went up for abuse of position, misuse of trust, etc., and then he came back down again, because the one thing with online gambling, you could prove that it all gone on gambling. It hadn't gone on a luxury lifestyle or lavish lifestyle or fancy cars or anything like that. It all gone on gambling. So he came down and I ended up getting 2 years, 8 months, which might sound, a good result from 7 years, but when you stood in the dock and you're being told you've got 2 years, 8 months in prison, you're away from your friends, you're away from your family, career in tatters, no money, no hope. It felt like a really long time. I got led away down to a courtroom cell and then got put on the back of a prison van. And it was actually a 17-year-old kid who was going to prison for the 9th time for really petty offences like shoplifting. He got about 2 weeks in prison or something. And he said, "What did you get? What did you get, suit?" Because I think I was the only one in there who got a suit on. He said, "What did you get?" And I said, "Oh, I got 2 years, 8 months." And he said, "You'll be out in less than a year." And I didn't really understand what he meant. And I said to him, "What do you mean?" And I'd done the usual Paul book thing, and I'd really studied what it was like to be in prison. How do you survive? What do you say? What do you not say? Because it was very intimidating going there. But what I hadn't looked at is if you get a sentence less than 4 years, you don't serve it all. So I genuinely thought I was going for 2 years, 8 months. And this kid on the way between Preston Crown Court and HMP Preston explained that, you serve half and then you serve the last 20 weeks on tag and you'll be out in 11 and a half months. And it was probably the chink of light I needed at that point. I thought I can do a year. I can do a year. I'll see him in a year, etc. So I ended up going there, spent 17 days in, as I said, quite a violent Victorian prison, and then the rest of the time in an open prison, working on, like, they have a farm there, and working in the library there, and really working out what I wanted to do in my life on release.
What's it like going into prison at those first steps you make? Is it again, like you say, don't make eye contact with anyone? Is it just like head down, keep yourself to yourself? Did you have to use physical violence amongst other people, or talk us through that? Because for myself, I can't. Yeah, I'd probably be studying it as well and thinking, well, how do I manage this situation?
Yeah, I'd spoken to a few people who'd been in before, and some real good advice was given. So, don't ask people what they're in for. Don't be nosy. Don't delve into things that aren't your business.
I'd be terrible then.
Yeah. And the other thing was, don't look for trouble. If you want trouble in prison, you'll find it. It's very easy to find. But if you want to keep your head down, then keep your head down. And usually people won't bother you unless you upset them in some way. So I very much took that advice on board. I kept my head down. To be honest, in Preston originally, you're locked up for 23 and a half hours a day. So you've only got your pad mate who you can talk to, really, other than meal times, where you kind of shuffled in and shuffled out, and then you can walk around an exercise yard a couple of times, and you're back in again. And it was when the London Olympics was on, so I remember watching a lot of the London Olympics in that cell, thinking this is one of the biggest sporting events that this country's ever seen, and I'm sat in here watching it, and it was a very surreal experience, but also incredibly violent. You saw a lot of rival gangs in there. You saw a lot of race problems in there between Asian guys and white guys who put on the same wing and everything. So I probably saw more violence in that 17 days, and really severe violence as well. You're not like a schoolyard punch up, really severe violence with weapons and everything in that 17 days than I'll probably ever see in the rest of my life combined. And then, as I said, I got moved out, and I ended up in an open prison where people think you've got all bankers and lawyers and accountants, and it's where all the white collar crime goes. But that's completely untrue. What you do in an open prison is you have people who are in the last 2 years of the sentence. So, it's an old RAF billet, and I was in with people who'd murdered people, who'd all kinds of crime except sex crimes, which weren't allowed in that prison. But there were people who'd been in prison for 25 years and 20 years plus, and these were people who were really struggling with the thought of going back out to the outside world again, and they go there to kind of try and reacclimatize themselves. So it was a very interesting experience. It's not one I'd recommend to anybody, but I think for me at the time, it gave me the time to really work out who I was, what I wanted to do, who was important to me, who wasn't, what was important to me, what wasn't.
So at this point in prison, are you getting help for the gambling? Because I was going to say, was it non-existent? And I guess also were the wheels in motion for Epic as well?
Yeah, no, there was no help in either of the prisons I was in. We've done some work since in prisons with Sodexo, with Epic, but there was nothing, literally nothing. I was presented, even when you have a OLAS report, it's called, which is a report on why you're in there and what you need to complete in prison before release and stuff. You had alcohol on there, you had drugs on there, you had all these different things on there, but gambling just wasn't even one of the tick boxes. So they wrote it in, gambling addiction. And then I remember one of the education rooms where they had an A to Z of issues in prison. So A, alcohol, B, and he had all these different things. It wasn't just one thing for each letter of the alphabet. But the thing that brought it home to me was the only thing under G was gout. So that problem you have with your feet. So gambling wasn't even on the wall.
Wow.
And I thought, wow. So I worked on the farm and doing quite menial stuff for quite a while. And then I got asked to work in a library where I taught 6 people to read over that final 10 months. And I also introduced something into the prison library called DVD Dads, which is where prisoners can tell a story to their kids on camera. It can be cut into a DVD and it can go home. So it's like a bedtime story.
Oh, great. Yeah.
It was quite interesting because you got quite a lot of wives and kids coming up to you in visits and saying, "Oh, thank you for sending that. It's made a real difference. He can now, he's sleeping properly again now. He's not getting as upset," and stuff like that. So it sounds really daft, but some of the things I'm most proud of I've done in my life actually happened in that library in terms of teaching people to read who couldn't and helping to help relationships. So don't worry, there was a big punishment because you're away from your family and your friends and your life, but it's about using the time positively.
We'll be hearing again from Paul shortly, but next up we'll be hearing from Stephen Nyandu, who works for Bet No More UK as their safer gambling advisor. Here's a bit more about them. Bet No More UK was established in 2013. Our charitable mission is to address gambling harms impacting on individuals, affected others, and UK communities. The lived experience of disruptive gambling behaviour, addiction, and recovery is at the heart of our work. We are so grateful to those who donate their life narratives, time, and energy in order to help others. And this includes members of our management board, support staff, and volunteers, as well as those we seek to help. Our award-winning services are co-produced, meaning they combine the knowledge and insight provided by experts by experience with proven evidence-based approaches. Stephen Nyandu is the Safer Gambling Advisor at Bet No More UK, and he joins me now. Hi, Stephen. Thanks for joining us today. Let's get into it, if we may. So, what is the current provision for prisoners who suffer from gambling-related harm?
Hi there, Alex. Thank you for having me. If you don't mind, I can just give you a little bit of background and more context in terms of the current provisions as far as I know it to date, to June 2020, and how it became to be me working in prison services. I started working in prison services as a volunteer in 2017. My role started as a mentor actually at Feltham Young Offenders Institutions, where I was mentoring young adults and, young offenders between the ages of 16 to 21 through their time in prisons. But already in 2017, I was very closely affiliated and worked with a gambling support service, Bet No More UK, who helped me overcome my addiction in February 2015, an addiction which I had suffered from for about 10 years of my life, really. So immediately I had a passion for that. And since then, I tried to draw the links between offending and gambling. So this is something which I wanted to do, including helping young people, improve their lives and, finding the best opportunities that they can, especially when they come out of prison, which is a very tough and challenging time. And I saw the social issues that gambling already had on the community. And I wanted to actually see the links which it had, with criminality and gambling. So I made it my mission to actually ensure that these provisions that were not there in place and the support that was very much needed was available. So I wanted to do that. So that's how it came to be. I started working in prison services. Since then, I've assumed different roles, of course, from mentoring, from delivering life skills, workshops, and working in, as of late, June 2020, in resettlement for 3 prisons in the southeast. That'd be ISIS. The other one was Thameside prison. And I did some work in Belmarsh. So the provisions when I was there between April 2019 to June 2020 was close to none, really. I found that I was asking questions about gambling on assessments and on questionnaires about prisoners and their potential relationship with gambling. And it was a yes or no, and whether they needed support for it. If they needed support for it, there wasn't much that they can do. So this information would just be taken and used as information potentially. It was only until of May 2019 or June 2019, I was actually offered to take a lead role as being the lead for finance, debt and gambling, where I was really able to start delivering that specialist support, which I've obtained from my time at Bet No More to actually help instill provisions in place. So if somebody had an issue, if they actually presented themselves to have an issue, they'll be referred to them. They'll be referred to me by talking to one of my colleagues, talking to somebody in healthcare, and they'll be signposted to me, the lead for safer gambling and gambling provisions. So it would consist of one-to-one sessions. It will consist of exercises, and we will put plans in place and try to put safeguards in place for when they're released. But there wasn't a through the gate kind of system in place to help them continue with their gambling. And that was a frustration for me because of the fact that, you know, there's no work that I was able to actually do when they were released from prison. So I was actually only able to put as much, you know, support in place for them in prisons, try to equip them with the most tools that I can, and signpost them to the best organizations, you know, which I can think of. And well, keep my fingers crossed that they stay on the path and adopt the journey to recovery when they're released, really. So as far as I know, you know, from 2017 till June 2020, that was the provisions in prison services, or lack of them.
For sure. So what work have you been doing in this area?
So in terms of the work that I've been doing in this area, of course, consists of mentoring, like I said, one-to-one support, and training. So that's the training of actually prisoners and staff members such as colleagues, and colleagues, of course, from other divisions in the prisons. So I delivered a few training sessions during my time in HMP Thameside, and I also was able to partner with a finance and debt organization who actually helped and assisted in getting prisoners tax rebates. And that organization was named Rift. And that was pretty good, really, because we found that plenty of people who were in prison, or prisoners, came to prison not having knowledge of the fact that they were still entitled to receiving some kind of tax benefits or tax rebates because they had, you know, a career or work before they came to prison, and that really helped. And through that process as well, I got a chance to find out more about the individuals, and broached, you know, certain questions around gambling and seeing if gambling was a part of their life and what types of relationships they had with gambling. And I was actually able to help them with that if it became an issue with them. So I'm happy, you know, about that. I'm happy to say that I was kind of part of that, and I'm happy to maybe say that I helped equip some of my colleagues, you know, with these skills and this awareness that maybe they didn't have, as well as they helped me with other things as well, which, you know, or learning, which I would of course take on with me through the rest of my life.
Fantastic. So Stephen, how do prisoners access support?
Alex, so during my time for example, working in Thameside Prison, I found that the support usually had to come to the prisoners and by chance. So through assessment, we used to have some form of assessment form. So this assessment form will be done when prisoners are going through the induction period, when they've actually just been, when they've just arrived at prison, so a few days after, and after sentencing or prior to release, to assess their needs and to actually find out if they have any issues, which need addressing. And of course, like I mentioned before, gambling was one of the questions asked. So unless that question was raised, there wasn't really much support, that could have been delivered by healthcare or any internal specialist support to help a prisoner with their gambling. So it just happens to be by chance that they had access to somebody with that experience and specialist knowledge in relation around gambling related harm, who was actually there on board to help. So I think more could be done about that. More could be done about accessibility, and I think we need to try to do more to kind of boost awareness and train staff in all areas, in all divisions, around gambling related harm, so prisoners can actually have more access to the support that they need should they need it, and staff are familiar with the issue. I think there's a lot of focus on drugs and alcohol. Of course, it's just as much serious, but I think there should, of course, be as much focus on gambling as well, because that's an addiction and that should be recognized as and appreciated for what it is, an addiction, and there should be support around that.
Absolutely. So what is the aftercare support treatment like once they've left prison?
If I had to be completely honest and frank, I would say, in my opinion, it's limited. Again, and as far as I know from June 2020, I don't know much about a stringent aftercare support service or a pathway for people who have suffered gambling related harms or who are suffering gambling related harms, or of course I should mention as well, who have been sent to prison due to an offence which they committed to fund their gambling or to fund their addiction. I don't know much about that, and I think one of the reasons why I don't know much about that is because there's not enough support provisions in place for treatment to support individuals and groups of people who have gone through the criminal justice system with this issue hanging over their head and maybe coming out with the same issue.
Absolutely. So what more do you think can be done then in the future?
There's plenty of things that can be done, actually. In my mind, I think it's time to kind of have a look and have a rethink and reevaluate how provisions and support is put in place in prisons. I think there's a lot of support in prisons, of course, but there's not much accessibility to support, and accessibility is lacking, and that's a fundamental word there, accessibility, because I think in terms of healthcare providers in prisons, in terms of their responsibility and their duties or the freedom to actually fulfill them, is quite limited. So if someone has an issue around gambling and it's affecting their mental health, it's impacting their life in different ways, their relationships, their family and stuff, I think it should be tackled as a mental health issue. I think people should, have access to support immediately. And one of the ways we can actually do that is actually have people with specialist knowledge, people with support, specialist support background around gambling related harms embedded in the prisons, or have an initiative or pilots in place where people, let's say for example like Bet No More UK, GamCare and other providers, can go inside prisons and actually help with their education, help with support of prisoners, who are suffering from gambling related harms or affected others, of course. And of course, that should extend to their staff, providing their staff with that support, with that knowledge. and that skill and expertise, I think it will go a long way to boost that awareness, and I think we will definitely do well with that type of effort to address and arrest, the effects of gambling related harms. Just to add to that, Alex, Bet No More UK, we very much advocate and encourage people, with lived experience to come forward and share their experience, whether they are still going through experiencing gambling related harms, whether they've overcome their addiction, especially if they've overcome their addiction, to come forward and share their experience and talk to individuals and talk to different groups of people who would very much benefit from listening to their stories, to present the idea and the fact that there is hope out there. Many people who are suffering from the addiction feel hopeless, feel compelled to embark on basically journeys and paths which are negative for them, and which can result in them, of course, ending up in prisons, of course. And if that opportunity is allowed for people who are in certain positions, like who are incarcerated, to actually hear the stories and the messages of hope, and how they can actually access support and how they can engage with services, who, like Bet No More and other providers out there who have made their lifelong mission and very much part of their ethos to try to change individuals' lives by impacting community, and the wider networks out there. I think that can very much go a long way, and I think that's important. And I think in terms of going forward, that's what can be done. Providing knowledge, education, awareness through sharing.
Mm-hmm.
I think that can be done.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm. Absolutely. Well, thanks so much, Stephen, for joining us today, and I wish you all the best for the future.
Thank you, Alex.
Bet No More's message is clear. Gambling should not compromise any aspects of your health and well-being. If what you've heard today has touched you, please take a look at our website, betnomoreuk.org, and follow our social media channels to have a look at what we do, at Bet No More and at AidPeer on Twitter. Without further ado, let's get back into part 2 of Paul's story. So Epic, talk us through, because I believe from hearing you on other podcasts that you've spoken about Epic kind of came around during your time inside, the idea, the epiphany, if you like. So have you come out of prison almost like a changed man? As your wife sort of felt that you've come out of prison, and you're like, hang on, this is a different Paul. Have you come out with a lot of motivation? You've obviously helped a lot of people in the library with the DVD dads. At this point, have you come out with the bit between your teeth and you're like, right, this is a new chance?
Yeah, no, absolutely. A bit like a coiled spring, I think, and probably a bit naive as well, thinking this has happened to me, so everyone will want to work with me and work with Epic and so on. But you're right, I had a decision to make. Do you go out there and get a job, or do you go out there and actually use your experiences to try and help other people? And the thing that was really obvious to me on really studying the scene of gambling was that actually there was nobody trying to stop people getting to the edge of a cliff in the first place with prevention. So, you had your GamCare, you had your GamCare partners, you had your National Problem Gambling Clinic with Henrietta, you had your private practices such as Cognacity or the Priory or places like that. But there was nobody, the only help that was available to anybody with gambling in the UK at that time in 2012-13 was treatment. So I'm thinking, well, why are we just letting people fall off the edge of a cliff and then access treatment? Why are we not doing anything to kind of prevent harm in the first place, or prevent people getting to the edge of the cliff? So, that was the first decision I made, is that's where I wanted to work. I didn't want to come out and compete with anyone. I didn't want to be a counsellor and be part of the treatment network or anything like that. I wanted to be someone who was starting to talk about prevention and starting to, get that talked about a bit more. So Epic came around, throwing a few acronyms around, but Epic is education, prevention, identification, control. And, it was originally called Epic Problem Gambling Consultancy, but I'm not a big believer in problem gambler and that phraseology. I never really was, even back then. So we changed it quite quickly with some help from Barclays as well to change it to Epic Risk Management. So it's a really stress, but this is a risk, both to individuals and to people and to organizations. And we came out and the reality was for about a year and a half, nothing happened. I was just phoning around, talking to people, trying to get introductions to people. And you were just happy if somebody picked up the phone or somebody was happy to listen to your story or something like that. But there was certainly no fee paying. I was a one-man band, etc. And then in 2015, a couple of things happened, really. One is we got our first member of staff in, a guy called Mark Potter, who's an ex-professional rugby union player who's still with us now. And also we won a couple of awards. We won the Big Issue Invest Corporate Social Venturing Award for future potential. And that gave us some funding as well. And we also got a gig with the Rugby Football Union and the Rugby Players Association to go around and educate professional rugby players in England across Saracens and Harlequins and places like that. And it's kind of snowballed from there, really. I always had 5 sectors in mind where I wanted to work. One was professional sport. One was education. So, we know now 500,000 kids are gambling every week. We know 62,000 have got an issue with gambling. They're the most scary stats of them all to me. But even back then, it was obvious that gambling was becoming an issue for kids. Armed forces, there seems to be a lot of data in different countries around armed forces. Criminal justice itself, which obviously I've seen on both sides of the fence. And financial services, which again, still to this day, probably don't do enough around this issue. So they were the 5 sectors, and we managed to just build client base around each of those sectors. And then in 2017, we went to a gambling commission board meeting to sort of explain what it is we were doing and so on. And we got asked, why are we not working with the sector where most harm exists? And I was a bit lost for words. I didn't really know which they meant. I just talked about education. I just talked about financial services, armed forces, criminal justice, sport. Where do they mean? And I remember Sarah Harrison's words exactly, who was the CEO prior to the one who's just left. And she said, everyone who gambles with a gambling operator. So everyone who has a problem with gambling also gambles with a gambling operator. So we can tell them what to do as a regulator, but why are you not the ones who are putting lived experience at the heart of showing them how to do it? And my initial reaction was no. I'm not interested in doing that. It's not in the business plan. I don't want to work. They won't want to work with us anyway. So no, I'm not doing it. But then it did play on my mind. I started talking to a few other people and so on. And I sort of said, look, what do you think about this? And they said, well, it does make sense. And so I thought, right, just to almost show the gambling commission, but we would do, and we're not against it, is I Googled who's the best at responsible gambling, and the same name kept coming up, which was a woman called Maris Bonello. So I got in touch with her, with Kindred, and said, would there be any interest? I've never worked with you before. And she said, yeah, no, definitely there would be. And we started working with their customer service teams and AML teams and so on. And that relationship and that journey has been a really interesting one. Some people don't agree with it at all, but a company who put lived experience at the heart of everything, we were the first ones to do that from day one. We've now got 13 plus another 4 lived experience in the foundation we've just set up. They don't believe that you should work with them at all. And I understand that point of view, because of course a lot of harm to a lot of people. But our view is very much, if we can improve standards even a little bit, and we're not going to change the world, we're not going to make them perfect, we're not going to, we're not going to stop all harm that comes from gambling operators as a little consultancy. But if we can just help with interactions, we can help with interventions, we can help with culture, we can help with tone of advertisements, etc., then surely that's a better thing to do than not do anything at all. And we've worked with certain operators, but we've also not worked with certain operators, because what we've always said is we're not going to work with anybody who's just ticking a box, who hasn't convinced us that they want to change their standards and improve their standards. There's some people who are surprised with who we have worked with. And and question that. And again, you know, we're not going to change everything that they do. I said, but you know, we do work with their customer service teams, we work with their AML teams, we work with their around interactions, advertisements and stuff, and all we can do is offer our advice and offer our wisdom from a lived experience viewpoint. Sometimes they'll listen, sometimes they won't, but the ones we do work with, we genuinely believe are trying to improve standards. But there's by no means perfect by any stretch, and I don't think they claim to be. But it's a process to improve those standards, and you know, education, awareness, training can play a part in that, but also regulation will also need to play a big part in that as well, in terms of setting the guidelines, which is what it's there for.
I was going to say, this brings us on to an off-air conversation we had a couple of weeks ago, and sort of on this subject. I thought you came up with quite a valid argument. It's like, well, we can wait around for the regulation to change, but until it does, which could take a year, could take 2 years, then why not work with the operators to try and prevent, you know, harm from happening? I mean, I suppose it seems sensible to talk about the Gambling Act review at this point. What are your thoughts on the Gambling Act review? What do you think should happen? Would you like to kind of just let us know your thoughts in general? Yeah,
I think the Gambling Act review is long overdue. The previous one was horrendously outdated. As I said to you before, gambling's a very, very different proposition now than it was in 2003 to 5 when that last one was dealt with. So I think it's long overdue. You hear the phrase, it needs to be brought into the digital age. Absolutely right. You know, online gambling and some of the products in online gambling are far more dangerous than what the 2005 Act dealt with. Our vision is all around. Our purpose is to save lives. Our mission is to take the problem out of gambling with lived experience at the heart of it. And that's really all we're interested in. You know, that's what we want to see. And our bedrocks really are that nobody under the age of 18 should be able to gamble on anything. Full stop. So. I'm glad now that that's being dealt with, because I think scratch cards being bought by 16-year-olds is a national scandal. I've got a 16-year-old and I wouldn't want him buying one scratch card, let alone hundreds. And I think the other one is nobody should be able to gamble £1, dollar or minute that they can't afford to lose. You know, and I think with technology now, you know, there needs to be a greater emphasis on reduction of harm using the technology and the AI and stuff which is available. So, you know, for me, it's about concentrating on the right things. It's being a collaborative effort. I think there are certain efforts that are too narrow, and it needs to be a broad collaborative effort. And then right things need to be brought in there, and things around vulnerability and affordability are probably at the heart of that, along with the absolute definitive stance that no one under the age of 18 can gamble at all on anything.
When you say collaboration, I mean, at this point, I do feel, I don't know, I suppose sitting in the middle as a podcaster, I guess, you kind of can't help but feel that could we not all kind of get around the table together? And I still feel that's perhaps missing, that sort of collaborative approach. It seems, you know, operators, lived experience, you know, you hear the kind of things being spouted out. It's like we want to use lived experience, et cetera, et cetera. And it seems at the moment, it seems quite tricky to see how that's going to fit. Do you think like the Gambling Commission needs to be reformed? Do you think it should exist? Do you think there should be an independent body? What are your thoughts?
I think a lot of it's broken, if I'm honest, Alex. I think, there's a very vocal campaigning section now, which is growing and is lived experience at the heart of some of that. I think there's the industry on the other side who are quite defensive and obviously are trying to fight their position for whatever reason people surmise. I don't think there's very much positive collaboration going on. I like to think we're in the middle as well. We've got some fantastic relationships with a lot of the lived experience community, almost all of them. But again, you know, we also have clients who work in the gambling industry, who are the gambling industry as well. But I don't think that there's been any real collaborative conversations between them. And I think it's a case now where it's going to go to everybody putting their evidence in, which has obviously happened in March. And I think the crucial part is going to be this next bit, which is who's reviewing that? Who's reviewing all the evidence that's gone in? You know, there seems to be some fantastic evidence. Epic's put its own evidence in from a prevention point of view, but who's going to be reviewing that? Who's going to decide which bits of that evidence goes in front of the decision makers? Because there's going to be thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of submission. So who's qualified to go through all that and decide what the important stuff is? So I think it's going to take a long time. I think it's going to take 18 to 24 months before anything major has happened. And that's where the conversation we had was about, that I can't wait that long. At this moment in time, the standards of interactions, interventions, and everything else, you know, they need to be worked on now, not in 18 months to 24 months time. So the Gambling Act review is absolutely crucial. It needs to bring gambling into the digital age. But in the meantime, the world can't stop. We've got to continue to improve standards. We've got to make sure that players are protected. We've got to make sure that harm is prevented. And we've got to make sure that people aren't suffering anything like what you, I, and so many other people have.
Absolutely. Are you okay for another five minutes or so?
Yeah,
great stuff. I mean, the thing is, Paul, there's so many different topics we can go into, and I've got, you know, as always, I say to every guest, I've got all these questions, and you know, I feel like we're just scratching the surface. But talk us through Epic. I mean, you're going into the US. You know, sports betting has been liberalised. Talk us through what you're doing over there.
Yeah. America for me is a massive, massive worry on a whole new scale to the UK. You know, they've traditionally had two states that have been legalized for sports betting, which is Nevada or Las Vegas, and New Jersey or Atlantic City. What happened a couple of years ago is something called PASPA was repealed. So that was the bill that stopped sports betting. And now states really have got the option to pursue sports betting on a state-by-state basis. And already we're on about 20 states who are now legalized for sports betting only 2 years later. And in the next 2 or 3 years, there'll be 48. So there'll probably only be 2 states out of the 50 which aren't legalized because of religious reasons. Wyoming and Utah, I think they are. And we went over in 2019. We were invited across to go and work with Major League and a couple of other places. And you know, we talked to them. Well, what do you mean by gambling problems? You know, if we talked about, you know, a gambling issue or gambling problem, what do you mean by that? And almost everybody that we talked to said, "Oh yeah, that's when an athlete influences a result. You know, that's when you know, someone takes a bribe or something like that." And that really worried me. I said, "Is there anything else?" And they went, "No, you know, it's just around that." So what they're talking about is betting integrity and match fixing and so on. So nobody at all was talking about relationship breakdowns. No one was talking about bankruptcy or financial problems. No one was talking about crime. No one was talking about suicide. And that just completely alarmed me. And I came back to the UK and I said, look, we've got to go and do something over there. We're only a little consultancy. We're not going to change the world, but there needs to be a prevention piece going on in America that educates people about what can happen if gambling, you know, gets out of control and turns into gambling disorders. And so we made that decision, and you know, touch wood, even with the pandemic apart, we've managed to reach some really good audiences with different partners. We're doing a big research thing with Harvard. We've got relationships with each of the major leagues really now. The NCAA colleges over there, which are massive. And we're also working quite a bit on the policy and legislation side of things to make sure that research, education and treatment is keeping up with pace with the growth of the gambling industry. But make no mistake, it's going to be huge. It's going to dwarf any other gambling industry anywhere in the world. And with that comes opportunity, I guess, for certain businesses, but also comes an awful lot of risks if those harms aren't educated around, and we don't have a public health approach over there, which make sure that harm is dealt with and is on the agenda. And right now it isn't. So I think there's a big piece of work to do over there, and a lot of Epic's efforts will be going into that kind of harm prevention space over there.
Absolutely. And talk us through the foundation, the Epic Foundation, the charity that's I guess, is it out there right now? I mean, time of recording, this is April. Obviously, this will go out, in the summer. Can you talk us through anything about the Epic Foundation?
Yeah, it's kind of half and half, Alex. So we've been recruiting for it. It's not been officially announced yet. It probably will have done by the time this podcast goes out. But again, we wanted to make sure we had a solidified social purpose on top of the work that we do, which is around preventing harm. We wanted to make sure we had a solidified social purpose. Again, keeping lived experience at the heart of everything, like we have done with everything since 2013. And we look for the missing piece of the jigsaw. What isn't happening now, which needs to? And we spoke to dozens of people from the lived experience community. We talked to researchers, some of the more respected researchers. We talked to a lot of different people in this space, like treatment providers, and said, look, what's the missing piece? And the thing that kept being spoken about is what happens post-treatment. So, you have quite a lot of money now, and people will argue about the effectiveness of how it's used or not around research, education, prevention, treatment. There's a lot of money now banded around with that, and different charities trying to deal with that, some more established ones and some quite new ones. But what happens after treatment? Somebody goes into treatment and they have their X number of counselling sessions with GAM Care, or been in Gordon Moody residentially, or been to Matt's clinics in the north or Henrietta's clinic in the south. What happens then? You've often got a CV with a gap in it. You don't know how to articulate your addiction. You've got resilience issues. You've got self-confidence issues. You don't know how to write a CV. You don't know how to write a business plan. So all these practical issues post-treatment, which stop so many people going on and leading positive and fulfilled lives. And whilst we can't promise them by going through the foundation programs that they will definitely have a positive life going forward, what we can promise them is they will have the tools to go and do that post being on the program. And that could be assistance with re-education, assistance with CV writing, business planning, resilience modules, financial modules. So it's that bit afterwards where you've been treated, you've been back out into the big wide world by your treatment provider, but actually, what do I do now? And again, we think if we get this right, which we are working furiously behind the scenes to do, then you will see a big reduction in certainly the people who go through the program in relapses, because a lot of relapse is done because they don't know how to move on, or because these barriers come up around employability, etc. So we think that will happen, and we will see hopefully an increase in the number of people who rebuild relationships with families, wives, partners, etc. So we're really proud of it. We're proud of what we're trying to do. We're not rushing it because we want to get it right, because this is people's lives we're dealing with. And people who have had a gambling addiction are vulnerable. So we want to make sure, and rather than just rushing out there and going head first, we want to make sure the program is out there, it's properly measured, it's properly being evaluated, and we've got the right content. But we have got a team in place. 80% of that team are lived experience, with some fantastic people who will probably be known by the time this goes out. So I can probably name them. So we've got Steve Ramsey, we've got Richie Paxton, we've got Mark Pickering, and we've got Andy Margaret as part of the team. So we're really proud of the team that we've got together, and we genuinely want to put people first, like we do in all parts of Epic.
Absolutely amazing. So Paul, in conclusion, I suppose I've got two questions. Firstly, what would you advise a young Paul Buck if you could go back in time? And then also, what would you advise other people that have experienced a gambling problem, and how to move on with their lives?
I suppose looking back, it's hard to advise a young Paul Buck because, everybody's journey is different, etc. But I suppose if you're looking at where my life has gone, it would be very much stick to your values. I think everybody should have their own personal values. And mine growing up were very much around sort of honesty, integrity, being a genuine person. But, it only took 4 or 5 days of peer pressure at university to get me into a bookie shop. And I didn't think I was doing anything wrong. I wasn't 4 or 5 days later going and mugging an old lady or breaking into a house or stealing a car. I didn't think anything was particularly wrong, but there's no doubt that in the initial stages, I was very much peer pressured into going in. So I think the big advice I would be is work out what's important to you, work out who you are, and absolutely stick to that. Just remind me your second question, Alex.
Well, I suppose it's what would you advise other people that are experiencing gambling problems, perhaps listening to this, or people that have already experienced gambling problems, they've given up, and how they can move on with their lives and lead a fulfilled life?
I would. They're different populations. I think the first population, those who are suffering a gambling problem right now, is talk about it. Reach out to somebody. Do not internalize it. I think the big problems happen when you internalize it. I internalized it for a year, for a decade. I didn't tell anybody. If you're feeling that gambling is taking over your life, so your thought processes or your time or your money or whatever, talk to somebody. Reach out as quickly as possible. And similarly, if somebody knows somebody who they think is suffering a gambling problem, have the conversation with them. Don't let it carry on to a point where you wish you'd had that conversation later on, but it's too late. So I think that would be my main advice for those people who had an addiction and are struggling to kind of move on. Don't let gambling define your life. You've probably been had a gambling disorder for a small part of your life. I'm 45. I had one for 10 years, so it's still less than a quarter of my life. Don't let it define you. Don't let it be the thing that stops you moving on and having a life yourself in a history. Of course, for some people, it's too late, and that's tragic. Where we look at suicide rates and everything. But you are not defined by your gambling disorder. So work out again what it is you want to achieve in life and go and get it, and use that experience of an addiction and overcoming that addiction as a real positive in your life, and go out and get whatever it is you want to achieve.
Some great advice there, Paul. Thank you so much for joining us today. Where can people find you? Are you on social media?
Yeah, we've our social media handle is @EpicPGC. Our website is www.epicriskmanagement.com. And we're also on LinkedIn as well, if anybody uses that medium. So yeah, we're not hard to find if anyone needs to get in touch. And if anyone wants to talk to any of the guys we've got in our team who are lived experience, I said between the foundation, Epic is about 16 or 17 now, then reach out. You'll never be turned away. It's really important to make sure you do reach out if you need to.
Amazing. Finally, is there anything else that you want to cover or say just before we go?
No, I don't think so, Alex. Thank you. I think I've really enjoyed doing that. I think we've covered some good topics. Obviously, it's going out in a couple of months, so a lot could happen in this sector in that time. Yeah. But no, overall, very happy to sort of share my experiences with you, and if it helps just one person, then definitely worth doing. So thanks for having me on.
No, you're welcome. Thank you very much, Paul, and I'll speak to you soon.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Lots to take away from Paul's story. What could you relate to? Were you peer pressured into betting at a young age? Did your gambling become a hidden problem? Did it lead you to commit crime? Let me know. Let's start a conversation. Feel free to drop me a comment on YouTube, message on social media, or get in touch with me confidentially via email, info@theinvisibleaddiction.com. That's it for this series. Thank you so much for tuning in. A massive thank you to all of our guests. There's a long list of names. Here we go. Thank you to Ben, Matt, James, Mike, Nick, Kieran, Bobby, Liz, Jean, Brian, Jack, Alex, Paul, and Stephen. I've really enjoyed speaking with them all and hearing their stories and opinions. I hope you've gotten value from the podcast. I hope you found it to be helpful and to help you feel more connected to others that have experienced the quote-unquote invisible addiction. Going forward, I plan to release another series. It'll be slightly shorter, around 6 episodes, and we'll focus mostly on gambling addiction stories and hearing how people have stopped gambling and got better. I'd like to inspire others to stop gambling and to inspire us all that you can lead a fulfilled and happy life without it. Finally, I'd like to say a massive thank you to the sponsors of the podcast, Talk Band Stop, for their ongoing support. And do look out for some vlogs that I'll be releasing on YouTube. And do feel free to leave a nice review of the podcast on iTunes. If you've got something nice to say, please feel free to say it. And if you don't, well, don't. In the meantime, thanks once again, guys. Enjoy the rest of your day. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon. Ta-da.